All right, so now we're going to get into how we control respiration. We're going to talk about the nervous system side of things, chemoreceptors, right, things of that nature, of how do we respond to changing levels in hydrogen ions, in carbon dioxide, and in oxygen, and then we'll get into things that can go wrong with that, and how do we make adjustments, not just when things are wrong, but when we do things like exercise. So let's talk about the neural control, meaning the nervous system's control. So number one, we have the medulla oblongata in its respiratory center, right? So the medulla oblongata is going to be one of the main things that provides this involuntary control, right? We're doing this through the phrenic nerve from the C3 to C6 end of things. And then with the medulla, this is where we're just getting you just basic rhythm of respiration. So just making sure you're just breathing, right? We're not worried so much about responding to different like changes necessarily. It's more of like making sure it just happens. And so the dorsal respiratory group found inside the medulla is going to stimulate the phrenic nerve for inhalation. The ventral respiratory group, also found in the medulla, is going to inhibit the phrenic nerve, and this is going to allow for exhalation, because the phrenic nerve, it's going to allow for those intercostals in the diaphragm to contract, which means inhalation. If we inhibit that nerve, then we relax those same muscles, which is exhalation. The pons is also going to help with the pontine respiratory group. This is going to have influence over the medulla itself. And again, we have a couple areas. We have the pneumotaxic, which is going to promote inhalation, and apneustic, which is going to inhibit inspiration. And so we look at where these things are. Right here, we see just before we get to the midbrain and the pons, we have the pontine respiratory group. And then we have the dorsal and the ventral respiratory groups right here, found in the medulla. We also have some other influences as well, so the cortical influences. This gives us a little bit of conscious control over respiration. This is necessary if we need to, let's say we're swimming, we don't want to inhale water, or there's something really smelly or whatever, so this allows us to hold our breath basically. So we have some influence using our cerebral cortex to overcome those things. Breath holding, though, is going to be limited. You can't hold your breath constantly. You can't hold your breath indefinitely, because if the hydrogen ion and the carbon dioxide concentrations get too high, you're going to be forced to breathe. And you've probably noticed that if you hold your breath for a while, you'll notice that you'll feel very uncomfortable. You'll feel that need to breathe, right? It's also why if a little kid is throwing a tantrum and they say they're going to hold their breath until they die to get their way, you can, kind of, sort of, you don't have to worry about them dying because they can't do that, right? They can hold their breath until they pass out, but they cannot hold their breath until they die necessarily. Then we get to the chemoreceptors, getting into the detection of changes in the blood. And this is where we're going to use chemoreceptors to help provide some feedback, right? So we're going to provide some feedback of things like the concentration of hydrogen ions, the concentration of carbon dioxide, of oxygen, right? So that we can make changes to breathing in response. And so the receptors in the chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata, they're going to look at carbon dioxide levels and then help kind of tell whether or not we need to increase or decrease that. The peripheral ones are going to monitor oxygen and the hydrogen ions so that we can increase that respiration. Hypercapnia, this is where we have an increase in carbon dioxide or the hydrogen ions. To a lesser extent, it helps us with knowing that we have low oxygen, but hypercapnia is going to increase the respiration rate, so how fast we're breathing, as well as deeper ventilation, so breathing deeper, that rather than a shallow breath. Hypocapnia, where these things are too low, is going to decrease the respiration rate. And so there's a couple things that can go wrong, some disorders that are associated with this, including hypercapnia. This is where you have a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and this stimulates those chemoreceptors to breathe more, so you're increasing how many breaths you're taking per minute. Hypocapnia is going to cause this is usually due to hyperventilation, right? So hyperventilation does cause cerebral vasoconstriction, which is why it can make you feel really lightheaded. If your arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide is lower than 40, then these chemoreceptors are not stimulated, and we just set our own pace until we accumulate up to 40. And then hypoxia, this is low oxygen. This is low partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues. This can be because we're at a high altitude. It can be because there's some sort of airway obstruction, so we're not able to breathe properly. Either something is there, like we're choking, or maybe there's fluid in the lungs, like we have some sort of illness. And then if we have a severe deficiency in this, we get an increased breathing rate to try to accommodate, to try to get more oxygen in to overcome that low concentration. Now, when it comes to exercise, we make adjustments in response to how intense the exercise is. So is it relatively easy? Is it moderate, or is it very intense? And then also the duration. Are we doing it for just a couple minutes? Are we doing this for 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, right? How long are we exercising for? And so as the cardiac output rises, which basically as the intensity and duration of the exercise, especially the intensity, as that increases, cardiac output will increase. And so blood flow to the lungs will increase, which means pulmonary perfusion. Those pulmonary capillaries are going to open up, right? And so we can see modifications to ventilation that increase 30 times over normal, over what we consider resting, right? And this is that initial rapid rate because of the neural influences, and then because the blood stimulate, like the chemical stimulation in the blood. So if we're looking at what we're doing, so here we're at rest, our ventilation, this is just liters per minute, so how much air we're able to breathe in and out in a given minute, volume-wise. And then when we're in exercise, we see very quickly, right, it jumps up in liters per minute until we're done exercising, and then we see recovery, we come back down, right? But that come down is a little bit slower than the initial jump we get, right, during exercise.